Hey, what's going on, guys? So, another year has passed, and we have a brand new year to look forward to, and a new year for you to grow as a developer and learn more to get where you want to be in your career. So, for those of you that are kind of new to this channel, this is something that I do every year. I've done it since 2017, and people seem to really like it. It's a complete map or guide to web development technologies and topics. So we talk about things like programming languages, frameworks, development tools, and much more. So I just want to mention that this is not a trends video like you see a lot of this time of year. I will talk about some recent trends like Web3 toward the end, but this is a complete guide from start to finish of essentially all web development technologies that are used today. I do have some stuff underlined, and that's just to let you know what I prefer personally. I'm not telling you you should use that. I'm just letting you know my personal preference because a lot of people ask me that. And then one thing I've changed from previous years is I used to put the names of videos on my channel that pertain to that particular technology that we're talking about. I used to put those in the sidebar, but this year I've actually added a page to my website that kind of goes along with the topics here with links to videos and courses for each section. So you can check that out. I'll put the link in the description for that. All right, so before we get into specific technologies, let's first talk about your overall goal and why you even want to code or why you code. So if writing code interests you, there's a few paths that you can take. And that's what I really love about writing code is you're not bound to just one thing. In fact, you could bounce around between a lot of these choices. I have myself. So I would say that the most common reason that people want to learn to code is to work for a company. Developers make a pretty good living, and a lot of us are passionate about it. So it's great to be able to go to work every day and do what you love. That's a dream for many people. And technology isn't going anywhere anytime soon, so you also have a lot of job security. So some people, including myself, like the idea of freelancing and running your own business. You can set your own hours, be your own boss, but it does take a lot of discipline to work for yourself. It can also get kind of lonely, so it's not for everybody. It has its pros and cons just like everything else. Another option is to build your own products or SaaSes, which stands for software as a service. This could be anything at all. Some examples could be selling your own templates or plugins. You could build something, let's say some kind of patient management portal or, an online photo editor, something like that. I mean, the possibilities are endless to what you can create and what can help people out. So it does take a lot of work and marketing to create successful products. You will probably have some failures, but that is a path you could take. You could get into my wheelhouse of creating educational content, although this isn't really something that I would suggest that you start with. It's a little weird to learn how to code and then go right into teaching without any experience, unless you've done it as a hobby for years, which actually brings me to my next option, which is to code as a hobby. It's absolutely fine to learn how to code and not use it to, as your living or whatever, to make any money from it. And you might even start as a hobby and find out that you're able to build something that can help a lot of people out, and you end up making a lot of money down the road. But my point is that there's a lot of different roads you can take. If you decide to take a certain road now, it doesn't mean you can't change it later. All right, so another thing that you're going to want to think about is what type of developer do you want to be or do you want to start with? Certain technologies are used for different parts of a website or a web app. So a front-end developer typically works on the client side or with the browser, and that's called the front end. So they build user interfaces, which is obviously the part of the application that the user deals with. Some typical tools that front-end developers need to know are HTML, CSS, JavaScript, working with the browsers, document object model, and they'll most likely be working with some kind of front-end JavaScript framework. So backend developers work with the server side, and that could be any kind of programming language. So you can use JavaScript with Node.js, but on the server you can also use PHP, Python, C#, Golang. There's a lot of different languages you could use, and I'm going to go over those later. And backend devs usually model data and also work with some kind of database. And then a full stack developer works on both the front end and the back end. It's also important to mention that these days, that line that separates the front end and back end is becoming more blurred. And as far as my audience and my viewers, I know that most of you guys are into full stack development. Now, these icons or these images on the side here, I'm going to label when something is front end, back end, and full stack with these icons. And a lot of what I'll be mentioning isn't mandatory that you learn. So if it is, I'll have a check mark along with the icon. All right, so there's only a few basic tools that are really required when we start doing web development. So obviously you need a computer to write code and you need an operating system on that computer. As far as the computer, you don't really need a powerful machine for web development. You can get just about anything from the last 10 years and it's fine for just basic web development. But I would suggest at least 8 gigabytes of memory. As far as the operating system, everyone has their own preference. There is no best operating system. I personally prefer Mac OS, but I also have a Windows machine that I use quite a bit. I run Linux on any servers that I have, and I'll talk more about servers later. You also have the Windows subsystem for Linux. Web browser, same thing. I prefer Chrome just because that's what I've used for the past decade or so. I do like the integrated developer tools, but all browsers these days have those to some extent. Firefox is also very popular with developers, and recently I've actually heard of a lot of people using Brave. Microsoft Edge, along with Brave, they're based on Chromium, so I mean any of these will really do for web development. So as far as writing code, you need a text editor or an IDE, which stands for Integrated Development Environment. So Visual Studio Code or VS Code is my favorite text editor and seems to kind of dominate at least the web development world. It's fast, it's intuitive, it has great extensions, it's free, it has a great community. But there are some others. Sublime Text is pretty popular. Vim is the successor of VI, which is a Unix-based text editor. And it seems a little difficult to learn, but people that use Vim seem to really love it. Okay, so the terminal is not something that you'll need to know right away, and if you're a front-end developer, you definitely don't need to master it, but you should know the basics when it comes to just navigating between folders and files. There are command line tools that you'll be using, no matter what type of developer you are. As far as which terminal you use, that's up to you. The default terminal is fine. That comes with Windows, Mac, whatever. I like iTerm for Mac OS. Windows users have PowerShell. They have WSL. I like to use a program called Git Bash when I use Windows. It's a very simple Unix-based terminal. And then you also have Hyper. It's very customizable. You can install extensions and so on. All right, so a lot of people ask me if they need to know any kind of design software. And in my opinion, if you're a front-end developer or a web designer, you should learn at least the basics of some kind of design tool. And if you're freelancing, you're most likely going to have to provide mock-ups to your clients, and you might want to know one of these. So some of the big ones, we have Figma, which is great. It runs right in the browser. It's powerful. It's free. I like Adobe XD just because I used to use Photoshop and Adobe Illustrator. And Photoshop is really geared towards photos. So I switched to Adobe XD because it's more geared towards UI design. That's what I prefer, but I would probably recommend Figma for someone that's just getting started. You also have Sketch, which is pretty popular, but I believe it's only for Mac. And then there's some others as well. Canva is a tool that you can use right in the browser. I'm not sure if it's free or not, but that's something that I see a lot of people using these days as well. All right, so HTML and CSS are always going to be the first web technology that you learn because they're the building blocks of the web. And no matter how sophisticated your web app, no matter what the language on the server you're using or what front-end framework you're using, in the end, it's going to be HTML and it's going to be styled with CSS in the browser. So typically you're going to learn both HTML and CSS at the same time, but you're going to focus most of your time on CSS just because it's much more difficult and there's just a lot more to learn than with HTML. So I think no matter what type of developer you are, even if you plan on being a backend developer, you should at least know the basics of HTML and CSS. So some things you want to learn. basic paragraph and heading tags and all that, but you also want to learn your HTML5 semantic tags like header, footer, section. It's really important to lay your pages out correctly with these semantic tags over just a bunch of divs. Then you want to get into CSS fundamentals, basic properties that have to do with colors, fonts, borders, margin padding. You want to understand the box model and how that works. And then alignment, of course, is really important. So Flexbox and Grid, both of those are great tools. I mean, I come from the days of using floats and tables for your layout, and I can tell you that CSS Grid and Flexbox are just they're godsends for web developers. So I would learn both. I tend to use CSS Grid for my overall layout, but Flexbox for aligning inner elements. And then media queries and responsive design. So I would say now in 2022 and maybe the past 7 or 8 years, I would say it's mandatory for everything that you build to look decent on a mobile device. Before that, it was kind of optional, but now with the amount of mobile device use, I think that it's mandatory that all your layouts look good on mobile devices. So simple animations and CSS transitions, they're not really crucial at this time, but you might want to just learn the basics of having something fade in and fade out and so on. All right, so as far as extra tools that you can learn at this point, Sass is a CSS preprocessor. There are others like Less and Stylus, but Sass is definitely the most popular. You can basically create Sass code, which is similar to CSS, but gives you some extra functionality, such as variables, functions, and mix-ins, and nesting. I do think that Sass is going to get pushed out because native CSS already has custom properties, which are basically variables. We're going to have nesting in CSS, and I think that there's going to be much less of a need for Sass. But with that said, I think you should learn it just because it's pretty easy to learn. There's just some extra features to learn, and then you just compile it with a Sass compiler down to CSS, and you include it in your projects. Also, if you really want to customize any CSS framework like Bootstrap, a lot of the times you'll use Sass for that, so that's another reason to learn it as well. And you could literally learn it in a weekend. So you might also have heard of PostCSS, which is a different thing. PostCSS is a tool for transforming CSS with JavaScript. It's used in a lot of bundlers like Parcel, some others, which I'll talk about later, but you can do a lot of the same stuff that Sass does by installing specific plugins. I personally don't use PostCSS that much, and I wouldn't suggest learning it at this point, but it might be beneficial to learn in the future. All right, so before you go on to learn JavaScript, you have the option to learn a CSS framework, and these frameworks basically give you predefined classes to style elements. Now, one thing I really want to stress here is that it's extremely important, at least in my opinion, to learn CSS before jumping into a framework. Once you can create just a decent looking website with HTML and CSS, then you might want to look into a framework because they can really help you speed up your projects and minimize the amount of CSS that you write, or eliminate the need to write CSS altogether.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, please like, follow, and subscribe to my channel for more tips, tutorials, and insight about programming. Stay tuned for more content and see you in the next video.